Welcome. My name is Morgan Burge, and I'm the Associate Pastor for Member Engagement and Digital Ministry here at RPC. This week, I get to interview our Senior Pastor, Jeff Meyers,
Hi,
about his
Morgan.
sermon. Hey. We're talking about your sermon, Why Give, which was our final sermon for our What is Our Why sermon series. And for everyone who is maybe new to listening, Closing the Distance is a podcast where we talk about the previous Sunday's sermon.
That's right. Let's
Thanks for
go.
sitting down to chat.
I hope you remember it better than I do.
Yeah, and I have some questions for you, actually, some things I want to unpack if you're ready.
Yeah, I'm ready. Let's go.
First and foremost, you started with a joke about two men on a deserted island. It talked about tithing, all that. And, me and my husband are pretty new here, and we're wondering how much we have to tithe in order for you to rescue us from the island.
Well, you're pretty vital to what we're doing here, so not much.
Just kidding. Just kidding. But in all honesty, I do think that there can be this sort of mentality about tithing, like giving in order to receive financially, prosperity gospel kind of like giving in order to receive financial or health blessings from the Lord. And I'm wondering if you can dispel some myths or some misunderstandings about tithing and share like where does the idea of tithing even come from?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It goes all the way back to the Old Testament. Uh, this is in Genesis when this guy Melchizedek shows up out of nowhere, and he's alluded to as a priest, and I think it's Abraham. I think tithes 10% of what he has, his resources to this priest in Thanksgiving for his rescue and his calling on his journey. And so that's where it comes out of. And then there were certain requirements to give to the temple um, when it was in Jesus' time. And then the Christian church kind of took that over. And usually it was 10%. Actually, it's kind of interesting. I think it's Muslims who require 10% as well, but they generally ask, I think it's, oh, now I'm out over my skis, but I think it's after taxes, and usually in the Christian tradition, it's before taxes, which can make a big difference what people
Okay.
tithe. But I read a story this past week with one of my Bible studies where some Pharisees come to Jesus and they have a criticism and they say, why don't your disciples follow the law? What is that? They say, why don't they wash their hands before they eat? Right. And and Jesus then comes back and he says, well, why don't you allow people to follow the law of honor your father and mother? And then he says, I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, you require people to give a certain amount to the temple, and yet in doing this, they're not able to fulfill their duties to take care of their father and their mother, uh, called
Mm,
Corbin. And so I think it's helpful to see this not as a hard and fast rule, but as a guide that God wants us to recognize all we have has been given to us and we're entrusted to use it. Okay. So we give out of thanksgiving for all that God has given us. We give because God has called us to be generous. Okay. And third, we give because if we're a part of a community, it takes resources and money to run and make things happen. And so, to pay salaries for the light bill, for the AC, keep, the streets pay, all these things that people don't see that go on behind the scenes. And so that's why God, I think, asks us to tithe. And, some people give 1%, some people 2%, some people 10%. And if you're not at 10%, what I encourage people is wherever you're at, prayerfully discern what God is asking you to give and then start giving it. And then in the next year, maybe increase it a percentage, increase a 0.5%. And I think people are able to give more than they think they can. But occasionally, somebody will lose a job and they'll send me an email and they say, we pledged to give so much this year. but we're not going to be able to fulfill our commitment. And I'm like, that's okay. I understand. We all have unexpected events in our lives. But then also I get emails from people who say, hey, you know what? God has blessed us. I had a great sales year. I got a promotion I wasn't expecting. I inherited some money. We're able to give above and beyond. And they generously give that. So
Oh,
that's
amazing.
that's really kind of my thinking about tithing in the church.
Yeah. And like the Lord, it's cool to see how the Lord provides through unexpected ways. And like when things do happen, where someone can't give as they planned, there's always someone who comes in and gives, above what they've planned. So
Yeah,
very interesting. And yeah, I think for me, as I reflect on like generosity and giving, even in my own life, I think about how hard it is in the US that we struggle to talk about money in general. And because it makes us feel uncomfortable or awkward. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about how our culture of like not being able to talk about money impacts our ability to be generous and to really invest in what God's doing.
that's a really great point. There's probably one of the most famous American theologian of the last 25 years, this guy out of Duke named Stanley Hauerwas. And he had a criticism on that point. He said, Americans should be required when they're joining the church to go down to the front of the church and declare how much they make every year. to So that they would be held accountable to be generous, to be good stewards. And I think a lot of us want to be private about these things because we're not generous, and so we feel a sense of guilt and shame around
Mhm.
those areas. So, I think being more open about it can lead to a freedom that we are not controlled and consumed by our money, by our resources, and that we'll be better stewards of what God has given us. I think, I always, in my experience, marriages tend to fall apart on around two areas: sex and money. And I
Yeah, I
think
do that.
I have no idea. Balloon for those who are just listening, balloons just came across our screen, which I don't know. I don't know
The
what we
Holy
said.
Spirit's confirmation of like,
The spirit is moving in this place. The spirit of Zoom. So I think marriages hit the rocks around sex and finances. And so I
Mhm.
think there's a lot of uncomfortableness talking about money. And I think there's a fear. I don't have enough.
Mhm.
Where are my resources and the money going to come in the future? The money I have, can I lose what I have? And
Mhm.
Americans, we just value so much. We're such a materialistic society,
Yeah.
that's where a lot of our self-worth comes from, our value. And as long as that's the case, I think if our value and self-worth is tied to how much money we have, we'll never feel like we have enough.
Right. Because it can shift at any time
Yeah.
and it does shift and our
Yeah.
needs shift. And yeah, it's a really good point. Yeah, my husband and I actually, um, obviously talk about money a lot,
Yeah.
and also like giving and which ministries and missions we're going to support, even like outside of church tithing.
Yeah.
And we realized like we grew up with really different views of money,
Oh, yeah.
so it's always a conversation. And to your point, it did come out in premarital counseling where we realized this is going to be something we talk about forever.
Well,
Um,
I'm so glad whoever did your premarital counseling brought that up,
mhm.
because it's going to come up at some point, and you need to have some sense of, if you don't have a common view, that you have a way to talk about it, that you can
Right.
resolve it, because that can be a real wedge in a relationship.
Yes, seriously. And like, yeah, I see money as I forget the word that they use, but just more like to for enjoying. He sees it for security. So it's like
Yeah.
pretty different. But yeah, I think that's been a conversation even when we think about like being generous and what we can save, what we can give, what we can spend, all of that. But
Yes.
yeah, what about you? Like how were you, when you were raised about thinking about money, how does that impact like the way that you guys give?
So so golly, how so I mean we my parents lived on a very strict budget. They were kind of Dave Ramsey kind of folks,
Hmm.
have the cash in the little pouches or buckets or whatever it was. And so, and I had an allowance for my that I got for my chores. I think it was like $1 a week or something. I was grossly underpaid.
Seriously.
And I was, my parents expected me to tithe, to give 10% to the church. And
Wow.
so, but for my father, I remember, my mom didn't work when we were kids. And I remember my dad always, he couldn't wait to retire. Like he saved, he waited, he couldn't wait for retirement. And then three events happened in the course of a month. He was diagnosed with prostate cancer.
Mm,
He lost his job. He was given what they call a golden handshake. So they, paid him out a sum of money for an early retirement. And then he invested with a guy that had been his financial planner for years. And the guy ended up, he had returned he had great returns. And the reason he had great returns was because he was running a Ponzi scheme. And the FBI called my dad and was like, this guy has squandered basically 90% of your wealth. So
wow.
my mom had to go back to work. My dad had to go back to work. And this vision of the future that they had planned for and worked so hard was gone. And
Mm,
I remember my dad said when all this happened, he really forced him to reevaluate his whole sense of self, his plans. And I remember he told me, he said he said a prayer in his office. He looked at the picture of his family and he said, that's what I really care about. And that
mm,
was a real prophetic moment in my own life. I was in my early 20s that like I had to be very careful about letting money define me too much because if I did, it could be gone like that.
yeah.
No fault of your own. The
Wow.
economy could go down. I lived through the 2008 financial crisis. I saw a lot of people go from thinking they were very wealthy to not
Hmm.
having anything. And
Right.
or in some cases less than nothing, when they were upside uh, underwater on their house and all this kind of stuff. And so I try to keep those memories in the back of my mind, not as a fear, but as a cautionary tale about where I'm at financially and how much of my faith and trust I put in those kinds of things.
Hmm. Wow. Thanks for sharing. That's really challenging.
Yeah, it was a
Like,
it was it was a time.
can't imagine. Yeah. And
And then my father, not long after that was diagnosed with dementia and had Alzheimer's. And so like this future that he had expected went very different than he had planned for.
mm-hmm.
And I think, sadly, and Morgan, you know this well, being a part of a congregation that we see people in all stages, ages of life, that things happen that we don't expect. And so
Mm-hmm.
your faith, your self-worth, your trust has to be in something that is more solid than your bank account, than your
Mm-hmm.
401k, than your house. Like
Yeah.
that's just um it, it's ephemeral. It can be it can slip away. It's like the Proverbs say, it's like smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Vanity of vanities, in Ecclesiastes says.
It's good stuff. Mm. It kind of reminds me though of that economist that you brought up, that Dr. Rodney Stark.
Oh, Rodney Stark,
His,
yeah. He's a
yeah, his
sociologist.
findings. Yeah, like his findings that the church grew and was exponentially growing because of this care of each other, this care of the marginalized and the least of these in society. And it, like what you were sharing, makes me think of like what what's the church's responsibility when that does happen to someone, a
Yeah.
family, who planned and did all the things, but they, circumstances change, and how the church can be really more similar to the early church in that where we take care of one another in those changes and use our money for the collective as well.
Yeah. And, we basically about 10% of our budget, so about $450,000 goes out the door to these kind of, I don't want to say social services, but ministry,
Yeah.
and we're at a place in our society where we have folks who specialize in various care. So like you trying to help out one family is great. If you're trying to help, let's say a mom with a single mom who's got several kids, you could maybe do some work, but you don't have the resources, you don't have the knowledge, you don't have, okay, all this stuff. And you
Right.
and you might try your best, but you're going to work around the clock, and we acknowledge that. And so we specialize. And so we partner with folks who have more resources that we can
Mhm.
contribute, that have the knowledge, that have the care. So like the Drake House, for instance, here in Roswell, that can take a family and help them get back on their feet, a mom with, and provide daycare and counseling and all the things that we can't provide. But we think it's important. So we give of our resources out from the church to empower these organizations like the Children's Development Academy, Home Stretch, Family Promise, all of these to make a difference in these folks who find themselves um, in situations where they really can't help themselves and they
Right.
need a hand up.
Which I think is kind of a humble way of approaching it, knowing like we can't be all and do all, but like really seeing ministry as a partnership. I think that's an amazing way to
Yeah.
spend our resources.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're really influenced by a couple of um, projects that culminate in books. One is When Helping Hurts by Brian Fickert,
Mm-hmm.
um, and then another book called Toxic Charity by Bob Lupton. Uh, Fickert's at a school outside Chattanooga. Bob Lupton was a community developer organizer in South Atlanta. And, like somebody comes here and they ask for a night stay at a hotel, or they ask for $50, for the bus, and we will occasionally do that and give that, but we realize that that's not sustainable to
Right.
help people really improve, and we've got to be more systematic and thoughtful. And so we do have to be humble that we cannot be this savior of people, that we've got to partner with others who know better how to help.
Right. It's good. I'm gonna have to check those books out. I've heard of them, but I've never actually spent time reading them.
Yeah, I actually interviewed Brian Fickert um, at the, we're used to go to church at the evening service. He's like a really interesting. He's like 6'8".
Oh.
He has a PhD in economics from Yale. I mean, really thoughtful guy. But I not to toot my own horn, but I did kind of go after him in the interview because I disagreed with some of his conclusions
Mm,
in the book. That I think it's sometimes it's more important for me to give charitably than and just to be generous and not care how somebody's going to use the money.
yeah.
Like people are like, well, what if they go buy beer, or what if they buy
Yeah.
drugs? Well, sometimes you're just called to give, and you're not supposed to control that person.
Yeah.
And it's more about you being generous than what they're going to do with those resources.
Totally agree. I
Yeah.
would have came after him too then. Yeah, I'm like, we're not God, so we
Yeah,
can't force people's choices.
that's right.
I
That's right.
have one more question
Yeah.
and then I'll let you go. But now you talked about this parable with the widow and the mite, and um something that I found really interesting is the you're describing the different courts of like from holiest to least holy. And
Yep.
I noticed that the court of women was considered, on the least holy end.
Right.
Um, but the temple treasury was housed there. So I thought it was interesting that, our money was keeping the temple afloat, but we were not considered holy. But in all
Right.
seriousness, did you know that women are technically the most generous group in the United States?
I
Like,
did not know that, but I'm not surprised.
I know, right? Single,
Not-
married, low income, high income. It's like no matter what it is, women are the most philanthropic.
yeah,
They give like at higher income amount or higher dollar amounts
that's
than
interesting. I did
their
not know
male.
that, but I'm not surprised.
Why aren't you surprised?
Well, I think many women are moms, and so they are, I mean, just by having children, the maternal instinct of having to care for others, I think it's easier to have what would I say, a charitable imagination of
Mm,
the need that other people have to be taken care of and to need help. I think men, and we're grossly kind of generalizing here because
for sure.
obviously I know stingy women and I know generous men, but we're talking
For
as
sure, for
a
sure.
group. I think I think some men in our society are enculturated to save and to hold on to better
Mm,
themselves in the long run.
It's like a
And
cultural problem,
yeah, I wonder because I
like
don't think it's like
pressures.
that maybe in every society. Um,
Hmm.
I would have to do some research. That would be an interesting study to do.
Yeah.
But I
Yeah.
also don't want to get myself into trouble by stereotyping too much. So
Right, right,
I have
right.
to go. I want to give as many qualifications as I can.
Right, right. Yeah, it was just interesting. I just noticed where the treasury was with the women, but that we weren't considered,
Right.
holy.
Is well, and and functionally, remember, so if you put the treasury in the court of the men, the women can't get to it. So they put
Things
it in
would
the
look
women. So
different
they know they can catch the men on the way through the court of the women.
through the court.
But they
Uh,
catch more people.
I'm
Um,
glad things have changed.
yeah,
So,
and this is what we have in Jesus Christ, right? That
yes,
the temple veil is torn asunder, and that we are all there's as the apostle Paul says, there's neither Jew or Greek, male or female, slave or free, that we are all one in Jesus Christ by our baptismal identity. And that's one of the reasons we find I personally find it really important that we ordain women that both to be clergy, but also as elders, and as leaders. They can teach, they can lead Sunday schools, they can teach our kids, like just like any man, right? That we're all one in Jesus Christ. And each of us, whether men or women, bring our own unique experience and calling by God to serve. And I think that's one of the great things. And I think we take it for granted that
mm,
this was a novel occurrence. That's one of the things that Stark gets at in the book is this is a new thing in the history of humanity, right?
mm,
And nowadays we take it for granted that we have social services and welfare and charitable organizations and we like just oh yeah it's always been like this. No,
right.
they used to, if you got sick in Rome during the plague in the first century, they threw your family members would throw you into the street to die,
Mm,
right? And the church was the one who came along, and their insight here was this: they saw that the plague was not a punishment from the gods on human
mhm,
beings. No, it was the result of a flawed creation that ought to be remediated, that needed to be healed, right? And that's a
yep,
very different view. And we
yeah.
take it for granted now because we live in a Western kind of Christianized Judeo-Christian culture, you know. And so I think as much as screwed up in our society and our world, it could be way worse.
Right? Because even like Christians were really instrumental in starting hospitals around the world
Yeah,
too. I just
that's right.
think like it is interesting caring for the hurting was a really big
Is
part of
fundamental
how we got
to who
started.
we are,
Yeah.
our identity as Christians and followers of Jesus Christ. And so while we want to take care of our buildings and our staff and ourselves, we also are called to serve people who are not a part of our group, those
Mm-hmm.
who are needy, those who are hurting. We need to be a force for good in our society.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jeff, this was a fun conversation and
Yeah, this went
thanks
by
for
fast,
sitting
Morgan.
down.
Thank you so much for talking today.
All right. I'll talk to you
All
soon.
right, see you soon.